BYOD was such an easy question or dilemma 10 years ago. The question is can corporate users access corporate data with equipment that corporate didn't buy? So employees, we're pretty much going to talk about employees, but it can go other places as well. Employees get equipment on their own that they want to do their job with. 10 years ago or so, it was a simple dilemma. No, you can't. Because the equipment that's out there really would just be just another computer. And companies, for the most part, were giving computers to their employees, so it really wasn't that neat. It wasn't that necessary. People got Palm Pilots. People got, little devices along those lines. But for the most part, they really didn't impact a person's productivity that much. So it wasn't that huge of a deal. And BlackBerries came on board. Okay, BlackBerries did very, very secure, very corporate, appropriate email. So it wasn't that big of a deal. Then it got tough. Then we ended up with, first of all, the big one, of course, was the iPad. All of these devices started coming out that people could access data and do things. And the problem was, it really did make them more productive. It really did. And so corporate IT could no longer just say, yeah, you've got that toy, but it's not that important. Now it was important. And so we have these two definitions. Yeah, corporate users can use it. But from management, and especially IT management standpoint, it's like we have no control over anything. We don't know who has what. We don't know what they're connecting with. We don't know how they're using it. And that becomes a real dilemma in terms of both support as well as control and security. And we'll talk about those things. And the pros. We're just going to go over this stuff relatively quickly. The pros, low capital cost. What does that mean? That means that somebody else is buying the equipment. The company doesn't have to. If Ralph goes out and buys a device and becomes productive using that device, then the company doesn't have to buy that device for him. Cool, we save money. Personal choice. Some people like Androids. Some people like iPods or Apple devices, iOS devices. Some people like Windows. Some people have their own whatever. If we let them bring their own devices in, then they can go with whatever they're most used to. A focused feature set. Every one of these devices has strengths and weaknesses. So if someone wants to have, for whatever reason, the flexibility of both personal and some professional stuff that the Apple devices, the iOS gives them, hey, they can use that. If someone wants to have, no, I want a Windows, they can go out and buy a Windows tablet. So we give them that choice. And fewer devices for the employee. I don't have to carry my home device around and my corporate device around. You could always tell that back in the day when people had pagers and phones. The pager was for work and the phone was for home. All right? Well, think of the same thing true with tablets. Or with, I've got my work laptop and I've got my home iPad. All right? If we allow them to bring their own device and they can just use their iPad, they don't have to carry their laptop around anymore. At least that's the theory. The cons. Security. If we're just letting stuff in, then we are, what's the term I'm looking for? Letting stuff in. We're not really keeping, we don't have gatekeepers. All right? Centralized support. We don't know what they're bringing. So we don't know if someone calls up and it says they have a problem because their kid downloaded, Whack-A-Zombie 2010. Unless we're familiar with Whack-A-Zombie 2010, which I'm not, we can't necessarily support that user. Which brings us to another higher cost of total ownership. And this is part that I was going to put lower cost of individual ownership, and cost includes support and protection. So if we have 100 employees, and those 100 employees are bringing in, let's say, 30 different combinations of devices, that means we have to be ready for 30 different scenarios, 30 different support situations, which is going to be difficult from a corporate standpoint to actually provide support and to ensure that those people can get their jobs done, while at the same time make sure that we're not compromising our security. So for example, if I have my iPad, and I'm using my iPad, which do not have the best built-in security in terms of accessing corporate data. We'll talk about specifically that. And my iPad is actually used by my grandkids to do whatever the heck they want to. That may not it may make this thing even worse. So what are the common dilemmas? And by this, I'm kind of speaking about, from a corporate, from an IT standpoint. Somebody brings this up. I just bought this fill in the blank. Whatever this latest whiz-bang thing is, make it work. Well, your staff may not know how to make this specifically work, so they're going to have to spend some time researching it. They're going to have to spend some time understanding it. They're going to have to match that to whatever the current setup is from the corporate standpoint. And every time somebody comes up with new models, they're going to have to go through a certain learning curve all over again. So the employee has bought it. They've purchased it. They've made the investment. They expect it to work. And if they haven't been told ahead of time to clearly understand the limits to their expectation, they're going to expect it to work. Now, it used to be the most common time we would see this would be when someone went to Best Buy to buy themselves a printer for their desk. And they expect the printer drivers to work fine and all that fun stuff. That was a pain in the tuchus, but we could deal with it. But now it's to the point where it's tablets, it can be phones, it can be any sort of thing. And especially if your organization has security built in on a decent level, there's a good possibility that the consumer versions of these devices are not going to be up to snuff as far as security goes. The second, multiple users. So we have a device that the person is going to use to try to access corporate data, but it turns out that that same device is used for things that are not appropriate. And not appropriate basically means that it opens it up to be compromised in terms of security goes. An example of this would be, again, Apple devices. Because Apple devices use iCloud. And all of your iCloud devices might be your iPhone, your iPad, your iPod, your iTunes, your this, whatever your iDot is, may use the same account and the same credentials. And so you could have people who are doing things on these devices which, again, compromise the security or the integrity, and you don't know about it. Okay? And then you have people who, it's their device, so they should be able to decide how secure to make it or not. They can decide or choose whether or not to update patches, whether or not to actually have an antivirus solution, whether or not to keep the antivirus solution intact. They can decide whether or not it's appropriate, because it's their device, not yours. But in each of these cases, these devices are brought to your organization with the idea that they're going to become more productive in using these devices. And they're going to rely on the corporation to at least provide some kind of support and some kind of assistance. If we don't define what our policy is in terms of using devices. So, and here's something, and we're going to spend a couple minutes on this, is why do we need the device? First of all, the absolute primary rule, and I probably should have put a separate slide on this, is increased productivity. If someone's bringing their own device, that is because that person will be more productive at the end of the day than devices or resources that's provided to them by corporate. That's the first test. If it doesn't pass that test, then that device is not needed. All right? Now, how do we increase the productivity through IT stuff? Well, first of all, a web app. That's probably the safest. Because the web application, by and large, I'm not getting into some of the details like Java or the like, or ActiveX controls or the like, by and large, the corporate web is on the web servers. So you're not actually installing something on this device. So if that device can run the corporate app, which not all devices can, not all devices can run all apps or all website apps, then this is probably going to be okay. And there's really not a lot of definition on this one. Okay? And then let's go down to the bottom here. Send and receive corporate email. Okay, that's also, there are a lot of applications that you can use on the different devices, especially if the company is using, you've got three primary types of email, right? You've got your Exchange email, in which case almost every device has some kind of client that can be used to send and receive email, right? You've got Lotus Notes, in which case there's not a lot of options, relatively speaking. You still do POP3 and IMAP. And then the third is POP3 and IMAP, which is basically, it's stored up in the cloud or stored somewhere on a server. You pull the email. Once you pull it to this device, it's pretty much gone on that device, which is POP3. Or there's some synchronization that happens, but there's some holes in it, which is more your IMAP. But the bottom line is most organizations are an exchange of some kind or another, whether it be a local exchange or Office 365, and almost all devices will do email synchronization and calendar and task synchronization. Not bad. And then synchronizing documents and files. This is tough because if you are reliant upon this person synchronizing it based on their solution, this would be where, yep, I installed Dropbox on my laptop. And I use Dropbox then, and I put the Dropbox client on my iPad. You're going to accept the fact that they did that and you have no control over it because it's their account. As opposed if you're using a corporate level tool, again, Anchor, OneDrive, the like, then you do have some control over that. And we'll get into why that's an important distinction. But the idea is that they're synchronizing documents and files. So it's on, these documents are on their device, their personal devices. Okay? Which means they can work on them from those devices. One of the things I should say as a side note here is you may have noticed within the past month, Microsoft has made some announcements regarding Office. Office is now becoming more and more platform neutral. So there's Office for the iOS devices, Office for Android. They've pretty much said they're going to be, it's going to be a platform neutral application by the end of the year. This is the kicker though. Connect directly to corporate assets. Now we're talking VPN, virtual private networking. We're talking remote desktop connections. We're talking all of those things where we actually have a connection between here's where the data is and here's where this device is. And let's assume for the moment that this device is not on corporate grounds. It actually is off-site, Starbucks, person's home, any of those sort of things. In which case now we want to make sure that we have an encrypted connection. We want to make sure that it's secure, and we want to make sure it's encrypted. But in any case, so what we want to do though is if we're going to connect directly to the servers, we want to make sure, number one, that our VPN requirements from a corporate security standpoint, our VPN requirements are sufficiently complex enough so that it can resist your average hacker, your average person trying to break in. And actually I think next month we're going to be talking about Security 101, so we'll deal with that a little more directly. But at the same time, it has to be flexible enough so that if you do want to let devices in, that it has that ability to do that. Now, iPads really don't do VPN very well. They don't do remote desktop terribly well either. The built-in functionality is not terribly secure, not terribly securable, and there are some third-party apps, but they're not great. So if you're going to start letting iPad devices to connect remotely to the corporate assets and the servers, you're going to be taking some risks. But these are the functions, these are the needs, these are the things that make people more productive. And so we're talking about policy goals. First of all, how does a company measure productivity, and really should be productivity gains versus centralized management? So if we're basically going to be able to say that, hey, if someone has this device, their productivity improves because they're able to do X, Y, Z, and they weren't able to do that before. That's a productivity gain. But they don't have this. They don't have anybody centralized doing a centralized management or support. So if this person has a problem with this device, we can't efficiently help them. Okay, and if they have a vulnerability for this device, can we necessarily manage it? Okay, so that needs to be at least discussed. What's corporate IT's responsibility for support? And that really needs to be communicated to the rest of the employees early on. If it's a buyer beware, if you buy it, hey, that's great, but if there's a problem with it, don't look to us. Then that needs to be told to people, so that situation where the person comes in and says, hey, I just bought this. And yeah, I mean, if it's simply a question of support, we may try to help them. We may, hey, let's do these things. Let's take a look, see what we can do. But at some point or another, to be able to say, yeah, I'm really not that familiar with these, and I really can't help you much anymore because we go with these devices or the like. And that gets bound to what's the employee's expectation? Do they need to talk to you ahead of time? Do they need to talk to, corporate IT or however that's defined ahead of time? Or should they? And if they don't, what happens? Now, part of the option can be, here are the devices we will support. Or, here are the devices we'll buy for you. There are solutions that can really nip this in the bud. So what do we need to define when we talk about a policy? Is what devices are permitted. If a device clearly has limitations in terms of security or things that don't necessarily apply to what the end user would think about. So for example, we talked about getting a lock for a door. And I'm going to make an analogy for end users that'll get me in trouble. I'm not going to ask my grandkids what kind of lock I should get on the door or what kind of doorknob or anything along those lines, because quite honestly, I'm the one who has to make sure that the house is secure. But I want to make sure it's something that they can open and close, especially when they're leaving. So I may cut down the number of or the types of devices based on what I already know are the needs. Also, I don't want to have to support 6 or 7 different types of machines, so I may cut down to we'll support Windows devices, we'll support Android devices, we'll support these, but not anything. Okay? So we want to try to cut it down. Now, 2 things happen. Some companies will actually have, here are the 2 models, the 3 models of devices that we'll support. That's great. We've got to update that pretty frequently, though, because these devices, there's always new stuff coming out. Okay? And in some cases, the company will actually provide them or provide a company discount or some kind of incentive. Those are cool, too. Support policy. Again, especially if you're limiting what they can connect to, what do they get in return? Are you willing to help them with problems? And if so, what type of problems? How far? If they're having a problem with a device that has absolutely nothing to do with work, but it prevents them from using it, zombie bopper 2010 or whatever it was, are you going to help them? And to what level? Security requirements. Do you want to require that this device cannot be used by anybody else? Can't be used by the kids. Do you want to require that they have to have antivirus? It has to be patched. It has to be up to date. It has to be active. It has to be legal. Are there any of those requirements that you want to put into play? Who owns what? Okay, we'll get you that device. Okay, thanks. Or excuse me, I just bought this device, but it doesn't have Office. Will you buy them Office? I just bought this device, but it doesn't have a VPN client, so I can't connect to the network. Will you buy the VPN client? And if so, are you going to upgrade it? Are you going to patch it? Are you going to make sure it's up to date? And is that their license or your license? Are you going to buy them antivirus software? Are you going to buy them backup software? What's allowed and prohibited? Are you going to set, like let's say there are some usage restrictions. If someone has this device, can they go ahead and do whatever they want to with it? Well, if they own it, it's kind of implied that, yeah, they can. Are you then going to allow it to connect to the network? Here's another one. So the employee leaves. Now what? Okay, how do you get your stuff back? Well, that's the question. There are some services. So for example, if we're doing Office 365, and if we do Office 365 and we allow the end user to install Office on their tablet or on their laptop or at home, as administrator, you can actually log onto the portal and disable it. So they will now no longer be able to, they'll basically no longer be able to use that software. All right. You can also, depending upon the synchronization, if they're using, I think OneDrive will do this, and I know Anchor will. Depending upon the synchronization, you can actually wipe the data that they've synchronized off of their remote device as well. So if someone leaves, you can, as long as they connect to the internet again, you can remove that data. Of course, if they know they're leaving or the like, they're going to, make sure they have a copy of that data before they turn in their notice. But so, and each one of these is a paragraph at most. I mean, without getting into real detail. But as far as for small, medium businesses, each one of these can pretty much be handled with a paragraph description of this is how we're doing things. So you're talking about a total of 2 pages tops that can go out to your employees and essentially say, hey, here's your expectations, good or bad. And to have that conversation early when you don't need it, and we can resolve this real easy by saying, no, you can't bring your own device, but we'll give you one, or we'll pay for half of this device specifically that you can use. If the company's willing to make that investment, this doesn't become an issue anymore. But you have to have this conversation. So, any questions on this stuff? It's actually, and this is a fairly, I guess, brief presentation, relatively speaking, but it really is a simple, for the size companies we're talking about, it really is a relatively simple process. We can then take it down to the nth level that we want to, as far as granular level and specifics, but until these questions are answered, the rest of the stuff is moot. The rest of the stuff are just technology and geek stuff, which without this stuff being answered, we really can't deal. Now, we can actually request, or excuse me, if it's a Windows environment, we can actually make it with the later versions of Windows Server. We can configure the Windows Active Directory to refuse connection to devices that don't meet certain standards. So we can actually automate some of the enforcement of these principles. We've got a ton of tools on how we make this happen. Some of them are included, they just need to be configured. Some of them are relatively low cost, some of them are very expensive. But until these questions are answered, we don't have a measuring stick. How do we validate? How do we justify the cost to configure that? So, and I hate to tell you this, but that was really the key stuff that we had today. Thank you.